Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Duncan White. I'm the convener of the Writers Speak series at the Mahendra Centre for the Humanities, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our final event for the academic year. And what a marvellous event we have lined up. Carmen Maria Machado is the dazzlingly talented author of the best-selling memoir In the Dream House, the short story collection Her Body and Other Parties, and the comic series The Low, Low Woods. Her work has been showered with accolades and prizes, including the Bard Fiction Prize, the Shirley Jackson Award, and the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, among many others. In 2018, the New York Times listed Her Body and Other Parties as one of the 15 remarkable books by women that are shaping the way we read and write fiction in the 21st century. Her stories and essays have appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times, Granta, Vogue, and elsewhere. Carmen is the Abrams Artist in Residence at the University of Pennsylvania. In conversation with Carmen is the brilliant Laura van den Berg. Laura is the award-winning author of 3 collections of short stories and 2 novels, and her stories have appeared in the Paris Review, McSweeney's, and Virginia Quarterly, among other venues. Her most recent collection of stories, I Hold a Wolf by the Ears, was selected by Time, Harper's, and NBC as one of the best books of 2020. She too has won the Bard Fiction Prize, among many other accolades, and was recently selected for a Guggenheim Fellowship. Laura is Senior Lecturer in Creative Writing at Harvard. Okay, before we get going, just a quick reminder that if you would like to ask a question, you can post it at any time using the Q&A prompt at the bottom of the Zoom. Okay, over to you, Laura and Carmen.
All right. Hey.
Hi, hello.
How's it going?
Good, how are you?
Good. Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you with us in the virtual dimension, wherever we are in space and time. Carmen and I are going to talk for a little bit, and then we will address, or I will feed your questions to Carmen for you to address later on. So please do feel free to go ahead and drop those into the Q&A box. And yeah, we'll see what's in there in a little while. Carmen, I thought just because we're on Zoom, I always like to get a sense of like where people are physically. Are you on campus right now? Like I see a room with lots of empty shelves behind you.
It's not the most, yeah, I am in a room on Harvard's campus. Yeah, because I did it at a classroom earlier today. So
okay, yeah, okay, awesome.
And yes, there are lots of eerily empty bookshelves behind me. It's
okay. Just great fodder for all the awesome haunted house convo that is to come. And I am in Florida, keeping one eye on my dog who loves to bark during Zoom events, but hopefully, yeah, he has a lot of opinions about a lot of things. So I thought that we could maybe start by talking about form, if that's okay. In the Dream House, one of your epigraphs is from the great Louise Bourgeois, and there's this line: "You pile up associations the way you pile up bricks. Memory itself is a form of architecture." And with both the memoir and the stories, I mean, one of the things that I admire so much about your work is the architecture and the way these formal experimentations come to hold really like potent ideas and feelings. So how do you think about architecture in prose? Like, is it something that you discover as you write the book or the story, or is it like the thing you start with?
It sort of depends on the project. So sometimes I do start very explicitly from a formal idea. So like Inventory in my first collection was like, I was like, I'm going to write a story that's like a list of sexual partners or like a list of sexual encounters. And that's going to be the structure of the story. Or Especially Heinous, I was like, I want it to be this like these Law and Order episodes. So sometimes I do start from these places of like these sort of explicitly formal projects. Occasionally I will like apply it sort of more retroactively, but I feel like the most organic, like the best version of it is when it arrives already like being thought of in that way, if that makes any sense. And I mean, obviously you can think about structure, you can have structure that's not like a form, that's not like a weird adopted or stolen structure. You can also just have like thinking about structure in general. And so I do often like do things like when I'm working on a story, like kind of map out like the way a story is sort of functioning, or like, you know, imagine it as like movements of music or something and think about it in that way as well. So it just sort of depends on like what the story is, where the idea came from, like if there is like an explicit formal element that I want to be exploring, or if it's a little more, or you know. So anyway, yeah, it sort of just depends.
Yeah. Within the dream house, and for those of you who haven't read this memoir, each section starts with the dream house as. So actually, I have the book right here. So the dream house as deja vu, the dream house as apartment in Philadelphia. And I love like the way that structure allows you to just sort of leap through space and time, and it makes available this really rich hybridity. Was that a project where you had that sort of formal conceit early on, dream house as, or did that emerge as you worked?
So basically, I had tried to write a version of this book for a while, and I had sort of gone through like many steps of, like trying to make the project make sense. And everything I wrote was so bad. And I would like read it and I'd be like, oh, this is like terrible. It's like, no one's ever going to want to read this. This is awful. And then I had this idea, thinking about it as this, with these like tiny chapters and these genre experiments, sort of almost like an exercise in style, Olympian style, sort of genre exercise. And like once I kind of happened upon that structure, the book kind of fell out of me in this very like organic way. And so I think that like what I was looking for in the thing that I was missing was this like higher level sort of structural consideration. And then once I sort of figured that out, everything else kind of fit into place. So yeah, so I feel like that project, like I tried it without it, and it wasn't until I got the structure that suddenly the book like made sense and had a sense of skeleton, like a sense of structure that made just feel very possible. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I personally find really challenging, I don't write a lot of nonfiction, but when I have, it's just like negotiating time, you know what I mean? Because in fiction, you get to make time up and it can be whatever you want it to be. But I often feel sort of trapped by like the timeline as it actually occurred. And so part of the, the challenge in the space for innovation is to figure out, how to deal with that. And I think that this seemed like the memoir moves in such an expansive way. And like I was saying, there's this really rich hybridity where it's, of course, a story rooted in your personal experiences, but also, widens into this deeper exploration of domestic abuse in queer communities, and, fairy tales sits alongside dreams, sits alongside critical scholarship. But it seemed like, there's not a sense of being kind of trapped in the sort of timeline as it unfolded. There's a real like elasticity of movement that the structure allows for.
Yeah, I remember when the book, one of the challenges of the book, and I remember like having this conversation with my editor fairly early on, was like, how do you write a work of nonfiction that is so grim in subject without it feeling like, I don't know, like just like trying to eat some wet cement where you're just like, oh my God, it's like too much, it's too much, it's too much. And we were I'm really interested, I think, in this idea, like when one is writing about intense material, I guess through fiction or nonfiction, though I feel like for me, this is like more of a nonfiction thing, was like, how do you create effervescence or levity or like air when you have a story that's like so intense? I feel like everyone's had the experience of like reading a story that's like so unrelentingly grim that you're like, I can't fucking handle this anymore. Like it's too intense. And so for me, like I was really trying to like fight against that from the beginning. I was like, I know this could be so intense. And so I need to create a sense of movement, a sense of like airiness, a sense of effervescence. And it's funny because people will tell me that they tore through the book in like one sitting. People tell me this all the time. And I'm like, I don't know how that's possible, because that book is like really dark, but they're like, there's something about it that I think has this propulsiveness. And I think it is that like part of it is the formal project of the book or the form of it, which I think gives it that, partially gives it that kind of air, and makes it much more easy to like bring inside of you, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. No, that totally makes sense. And there are these kinds of like release valves in some ways from the most intense material. But yes, I revisited Crime and Punishment recently with a book club, and I was like, I can't. 2022, like it's sorry.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I was like, simply cannot. No effervescence at all. Yeah. But yes, that kind of that sort of hopscotch like movement does create, I think, some useful air. I have for a very long time been actually hoping that we would talk one day so I could ask you about haunted houses, because I love haunted houses and I love haunted house literature, and I'm very interested in sort of your own representations and explorations of haunted houses. That in the dream house, there's a house in Indiana that's very central and kind of a central anchor, and it, you know, takes on the feel of being kind of a haunted space as the story unfolds. And then you work with a haunted house also in your short fiction, thinking of Horror Story as one example. And I think, like, for me, the most interesting haunted house stories invite these collisions between like interior and exterior, tangible, intangible, past and present, and all of that. And I'm curious, like, what is writing into haunted spaces? What does that mean for you? What does it open up?
I mean, I am also like, I love haunted houses. I will read any haunted house novel and watch any haunted house movie, no matter what the quality is. Like, I find that genre or that subgenre to be like one of the richest and most interesting, at least for me. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, like, right, the house is like this sort of nexus of like all these forces. So it's like the, you know, the space of the domestic, so-called like women's spaces, right? Or like domestic space. You know, it's this place where like childhood and adulthood intersect, this place where time intersects, where like you live in a house and like someone almost certainly, unless you've just built the house yourself, like lived in the house before you, you know, or even like lived on the land before you were on the land. And there's just this like sense of time like colliding with itself, where it's like the past is like asserting itself against the present, and like you can see it and you can feel it. And also haunted house novels, you know, end up sort of being these containers, I think, for a lot of like social ideas. So there's this really great book that I love by Colin Dickey called oh my God, what's it called? Do you know this book? The title is just completely run out of my brain.
I have read it, but also cannot remember.
I'm like Hauntings. So it's something in the history of American hauntings. Ghostland.
Yes,
thank you. I don't know what that was about. Anyway, so yeah, so in that book it talks about like how all, you know, ways in which we think about ghosts, and how like, you know, the idea of like the Indian burial ground, quote unquote, or like the idea of like, what is the race of ghosts? Like, why is it in these spaces where like there's a massive history of like enslavement of people, are all the ghosts white, right? And like not Black. And so there's like all these like really interesting sort of questions that I think are asked by ghost stories, haunted house stories. And so I just find, and also, yeah, this idea of like structure, like containing time in this way, I just find like endlessly riveting. And so I don't know, I think it's this, there's something about the space of a house, and like also being, you can be trapped in a house too. Like a house can be safe, and a house can be a place you want to be, and also can be a place that you can't escape. And, you know, I mean, it wasn't lost on me. Like, you know, the book came out right before COVID. And like, I remember when COVID began and like the lockdown started, my first thought was like, pour one out for the fucking people who are currently now trapped in a house with somebody they don't want to be trapped in a house with, you know? And so I feel like there's just something about like that space that feels like so fraught and so contradictory and so sort of like, and just like a portal of time. It just feels like this really rich space. And I just have endless appetite for it. I don't know what it is, but it's just, yeah, it's a genre that like really speaks to me.
Yeah, same. That was a wonderful answer. And I think that, yeah, I mean, you were speaking to this too, but it's like, it forces characters to contend with history, you know? Yeah. It's like hauntings are so often about, and, you know, it's, you know, we can think of history in the broader sense, you know, history of place, national history, national trauma, and so on. And also in some cases, like the individual personal histories that characters bring with them into spaces. But I think that that's one thing that's like very inherently kind of provocative about the genre, and especially now, right? It's, you know, I mean, like that kind of continual sort of impulse, you know, in our American culture to like not want to, you know, engage with history in a kind of a full and honest way. And it's like the haunted house stories like that. I feel like that's one of the kind of archetypal stories that, you know, sort of forces characters to be like, you have to contend with what has happened in the past. You have to, if you have any hope of somehow escaping this, you know, hell state that you're in, like you have to contend with the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have, what are some of your favorite haunted house? I mean, you mentioned Colin Dickey's book, which is, yeah, very wonderful. What are some of your favorite haunted house narratives?
Yeah, I actually taught a haunted house class at Penn a couple of years ago. And it was so fun to get to put that class together, and it was just me like thinking about this thing that I'm obsessed with. So it was like a little informal, like it was just me being like, let's read this and like talk about it. But I really loved, we read The Poetics of Space by Baudrillard, which was like really, really important for that class. we read The Haunting of Hill House. We read one of my favorite haunted house novels is this novel called The House Next Door by Anne Rivers Seddon, which is just like this incredibly creepy, like Southern Gothic haunted house novel from like the 70s. I love The Elementals, which is by, oh my God, what's his name? I can't remember his name. Michael, no. I can't remember. Anyway, it's a really great novel called The Elementals. I really love, Beloved is like a wonderful haunted house novel, which I taught in that class as well. And we also did things like we read from like, there's a really great case law in New York State that's basically a case law that says for the legal purposes, this house is haunted. It's like a case law where a couple bought a house that had a reputation of being haunted in the community and then felt like it had damaged the value of the house because they had not been disclosed to them before they bought it. And so it's like this judge giving this like ruling in which he basically says, this house is haunted, like legally speaking, you know? So that was like wonderful. We read this really great essay by Jamaica Kincaid that was in the New Yorker in like the 90s. That's about like her moving into this house. And it's this whole idea of like part of being an American, like her sort of thesis is like being an American means you never live in the house you grew up in. You always are somewhere else. So there's just like, I don't know. I just feel like there's something about, or like Late Victorians by Rodriguez is his last name. I can't remember his first name, but like it was just about like sort of gay men in San Francisco, like creating these sort of like, you know, found families, you know, in the sort of pre-AIDS and the AIDS era. Like, I don't know. I feel like, again, like houses just feel like such rich texts. And like, you can really think of anything about a house as kind of a haunted house, like, which I sort of love, feels appropriate. I don't know.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for that amazing reading list. I'm excited to check out the ones that I don't yet know. Yeah, I think, and it's like, kind of like the fairy tale in a way where there's this great flexibility to the ghost story, which you were speaking to, right? Because yeah, houses can kind of mutate in all of these ways. And they're these kind of like terrifically alive spaces. So staying with non-realism, I guess, although it's debatable, I feel it's very debatable whether I totally believe in hauntings. So we'll just loosely categorize it as non-realism to get to this question. But there was this wonderful line that I came across from an interview I think that you did with a Los Angeles Review of Books, where you said that I just feel like we need more than reality to accurately describe reality. And that resonates with me so much. I mean, I think just living in Florida, I see stuff all the time where I'm sort of like, you know, to describe this in factual terms would somehow not do it justice.
Yeah.
So some kind of essential essence would be missed. But I'm interested in this idea. I just feel like we need more than reality to accurately describe reality. And I wonder what can tell us more, if you will, about this idea of needing more than reality and how that informs your work.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's so funny because like I guess I could say personally, like I actually don't believe in hauntings or ghosts. Like I am a person, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's nothing I would rather be truer than like, if you told me that if I could make anything real, I'd be like, make ghosts real. Like I would fucking love that. But I don't believe that they are, you know, that's just my perspective. And I was like a very religious teenager, so who believed in like whole this universe of like that included things like angels and demons and God and like all this stuff. And like I don't believe that anymore. And I feel like ghosts kind of went that way, you know, where I just like that doesn't really fit into like the way I see the world. That being said, as a writer, as a fiction writer, yeah, like to me, like so much of what I experience is so intangible and is so, you know, in some ways I feel like one's own interior self is a kind of ghost, right? Like I love to say when I meet someone and we have like a sort of ineffable kind of connection, I'll say like, my ghost touches your ghost. Like there's like something inside of me that's touching something inside of you. And like, it's like a really beautiful moment, but it's like kind of hard to articulate or describe, besides thinking of it as like, I have a spirit, you have a spirit, and like the spirits are connecting with each other, right? And so I feel like, yeah, like there's something about the language of hauntings and the language of the supernatural and the language of monsters and the language of all these things that like, and I think religion's a good example of like, you know, like we need to put language or to ideas that are like too big for us to comprehend. And so, you know, we have these like, you know, very complicated sort of systems of theology, which like, you know, sort of encompass all of our, like a lot of our myths and our beliefs. And so it just feels to me like fiction is the same way, where it's like, if I really want to accurately talk about something, it feels like I need to like reach for these tools of like things that are not possibly real. And I feel like so much of what's inside of us, I mean, like I really love when I've taught this essay on by Lovecraft before, where Lovecraft sort of talks about how like we all have such weird shit inside of us that like sometimes you just like reach out and like discharge that energy like a lightning, like static electricity. Like you just are like, the world is so strange and unknowable, and like there are so many things that I don't understand that like it just creates like an energy inside of you that you have to like put somewhere, you know? And I feel like that, yeah, like that feels correct to me. And like as a person who doesn't believe in those things, like I still feel like there's so many moments of like the unknown and so many moments of mystery. And like, you know, even though I don't believe in those things, I do believe in like submitting to the mystery and submitting to the unknown and like being like, yeah, this is like a part of the human experience. It's this like beautiful sort of piece of my life that like I wouldn't trade for anything. And like that's ghosts and that's, you know, monsters, and that's like the stuff that and that's like, and like for me, like when I'm writing, I mean, I don't think everyone has to do that, but for me, like it feels like I have to reach for those things to like fully demonstrate like how I feel about a subject or an idea or an experience. It just feels like the only way I know how to do it.
Yeah, I love that phrase, submitting to the mystery. That's really wonderful. Yeah, I think that that definitely makes sense. And I think it becomes that non-realism is like it, you know, I think of it as being like another like language, you know, that we have access to as writers, or another mode of communication. And yeah, and there's certain sort of scenarios or material or kind of, you know, or types of time or emotional experiences where, yeah, it's like for some reason they need that other gear, that other mode. You've also talked about non-realism as a way to, and I'm quoting you now, to tap into aspects of being a woman that can be surreal or somehow liminal, certain experiences that can feel even like horror. Non-realism makes room for mythic expressions of the female experience. And I love this idea of non-realism making space for mythic expressions of the female experience. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you also can think of it, you can kind of insert any number of experiences into there, like experiences of that again are like, it's a way, it's like kind of the same question, right? It's like there are things that are like impossible to articulate or describe that exist when you exist in some liminal or marginal space, right? And so what better way to like articulate a liminal state of being than a liminal being, right? Like, you know, what better way to like make that connection, you know? And it's funny because I feel like in some ways you see this so literally, like I'm just remembering like probably a not very good episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer where like there's a girl who like no one notices her, so she turns invisible, and then she's like literally invisible and like wreaking havoc and like getting her revenge, you know? And like, I mean, that's kind of like on the nose. Or is that Buffy, or is that or is that Smallville? It could be both. I don't know. Anyway, the point is that, you know, that's like the very obvious version, but like, right, like there are so many ways in which it's like really hard to talk. So like, for example, like in my first book, you know, I really wanted to talk about sexual violence, and I was like, I really want to write a story about sexual violence, but you know, it's like, it's hard to do that in a way that feels true and like untold. And then eventually I sort of figured out like, well, like what if I use this like sort of fabulous or fantastic sort of detail of like this woman, like, you know, experienced sexual violence and sort of lost her interiority and is trying to like claw her way back to her own interiority. And the only way she can do that is by, in her case, hearing the voices of actors in pornographic films. Like she hears their thoughts. So it's like she's hearing someone else's interiority, but not her own. And so, you know, sort of like let's sort of think about this very specific mode of being, and then use like a supernatural or like a, you know, a non-realist element to like pin that down like very precisely. And that's sort of my project. Like I feel like that's like what I want to be doing with my work. It's like the thing that, it's like just the thing that, you know, comes to me. So I don't know, it's like the only way I know how to write at this point.
Yeah, totally. And I think sometimes the fantastic spaces, you know, it's like it creates an emotional experience that is sort of inhabitable for a reader, right? And it's like, it's that I always think of it, it's like reported experience versus felt experience. And it's kind of like, I go so much to fiction for me personally for kind of felt experience. And I think sometimes those you know, fabulous spaces can create these experiences where you're not just kind of hearing about it or learning about it. You're sort of standing inside it in a way.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. I feel we'd be very remiss if we did not talk about short stories specifically. You of course are the author of the very wonderful Her Body and Other Parties, and you have a new collection coming out, right?
I do. It's not, I mean, it's coming out. I haven't finished writing it yet, so I don't know when exactly it's coming out, but yes, I have a new collection coming out called A Brief and Fearful Star.
Okay.
Coming out
sometime
in the future, assuming it's still here in a few years. Yes.
Some point in the future. So that, and what calls you to the form?
God, I love short stories. It's so funny to me because it's like, I think some people, you know, because graduate programs or MFA programs, you know, obviously tend to prioritize them because I feel like the short story is sort of the easiest thing to workshop, right? And so people write them and a lot of people like move on and do other things. I fucking love the short story. Like if I wrote short stories exclusively for the rest of my life, I would have no complaints. Like it is a form that like gives me a lot of pleasure. It brings to me a sense of peace. I like understand how a short story works, and the experience of reading a short story, like entering a short story, is just to me so singular and specific that I just can't imagine, you know. And it's like I'm like, maybe I'll write a novel one day, I don't know, but like I keep trying and failing, but for me, the short story is like a natural form. It's like a laboratory. It's like a space of tremendous experimentation, which I really appreciate, and which like gives me a sense of play that I think I find so enriching as a writer, and like is really what I want to be doing. So so for me, I don't know, short stories, just, I don't know, it's like a form that if you tell me a writer that I should read and you're like, here's a novel they wrote and here's a short story collection, I'll always get the short story collection first, because you can see like a kind of range that I think is harder to see in a novel. So no, I don't know, I love the form. It's like, and they don't sell very well, and everyone tells you that, and if they're really hard to put into a book, I mean, it's just like, it's a nightmare trying to sell them, but it is my favorite thing. So
they are pretty amazing. I think, just to sort of stay with this idea of like play in the form, I mean, I think because of the compression, I don't know if this will resonate with you, but I think also it can be easier to accept like failure, because, you know, if I write a short story and I spend 2 months on it and I get to the end of it and I read it over and I'm like, this is terrible and there's no hope that it will ever get better, I can just like put it in the recycling bin and move on to the next one. But, you know, I think, and I have had that experience with novels for sure. I mean, I think it's like quite common where you know, work on 200 pages for a year and then sort of have to, you know, I know, like, it makes me want to do that, like the Home Alone, the like Home Alone scream, you know, the like, but that, right. That's like, I'm like, you know, I need to like get in bed for a week and just pull the, you know, covers over my head. So I think that and it's like, it feels weird. I always feel a little uneasy saying that, because I mean, the short story is the first form of literature that I fell in love with. Like, there's nothing that I take kind of more seriously as a writer. So I don't mean to imply that they're somehow less kind of weighty or they mean less to the writers who write them. But do you think that there's some kind of relationship between the sort of the brevity of the form and like that we maybe are like freer to fail in that space somehow, or failure feels less fraught or like consequential?
No, I mean, I feel like that is honestly the thing, because I think I mean, I've written failed novel drafts, and it is so horrifying to be like, oh, all this time that I spent is just like for naught. And I mean, I wouldn't even spend 2 months on a short story. I feel like a short story, I would just be like, couple weeks at the max, and then I'd be like, oh, this is not working, and I will just move on. And I have lots of like failed short story drafts, because yeah, it does feel like a little less consequential. I mean, ultimately, like as you know, and as I know, like one day we will die, and like we have to think about how we want to be like meeting out our time, and you know, in various ways until we like get to that our end. So, you know, I don't know. I really sorry, that's very dark. But yeah, no, I mean, I also like the short story for me. I had to remember like, because I remember the first, I feel like the writer who made the biggest impression on me as a young person, or one of the writers, was Ray Bradbury. And I read like all of Ray Bradbury's, and there was like this one Ray Bradbury anthology with this very like funky kind of psychedelic 70s cover that I used to check out at the library constantly and like would just read cover to cover. And like, it's funny because when you read that book, like some short stories are fucking bangers and some are not that great, you know? And like, he actually was writing to like support his family. And so like, he was just churning out short stories at some like ungodly rate. And so you're getting a wide, you're like, oh, some of these are way better than others, like, you know, and some of them you've like, I've never heard this story and now I know why, you know, but I do feel like you also can see him just like playing and experimenting and recycling. And like, he's just like doing this thing kind of over and over. And it's like really fascinating to watch. And I just feel like that, for me, that space, it's like less consequential. And, you know, whereas like I might retire a short story, he would just be like, I'm going to sell it so I can make some money because that's how I'm supporting myself. But like, I don't know. Yeah. For me, it's like, yeah, you can just sort of like do it. And then if you fail, you can move on. And like, you can do that until you have enough stuff that's working. And like, that's kind of beautiful. Yeah. So I love that. That makes me, yeah, that I feel like I agree.
Yeah, I the last time I was at a residency in the pre-COVID days, I was working on it's only on stories, and I was like, I cry a lot at residencies because I'm usually in some sort of like hideous novel revision, and I was like, why am I so happy? Why do I feel so good? Why haven't I cried yet? And I was like, wait a minute, I know why.
Yeah. I'm doing the only thing that matters, which is stories.
So I definitely understand the joy giving quality of the form. So like switching gears a little bit to just talk about process, I suspect, I know you met with students earlier today, and I suspect that there are, you know, probably a lot of writers in this space. I wanted to talk a bit about just like getting stuck and what you do when the writing, you know, we would love to be in the joy-giving space all the time, but what do you do? What do you do when the writing gets hard? And I was thinking, actually, you know, I was quite struck by that moment earlier in our conversation. We were talking about the first draft of In the Dream House, and you know, had tried to write in this way, and you got it to the, you know, you got to the end. You were like, oh no, this is not at all what I want to be doing with his project. And, you know, I think anyone who's attempted to write a book knows how devastating it can be to kind of come upon that gap between the thing that you've imagined in your head and the thing that you've actually produced. And so how did you, like, what did you do after that? How did you move forward? How did you move into the right thing ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, so much of writing obviously is failure, right? Failing to like do the thing that you want to be doing. And I think there's something that you have to learn, right? About like figuring out what is this gap between the thing I'm imagining, the thing that I'm creating. Is it bridgeable at all? Like, and sometimes that question is just like, is the thing broken? Maybe the story idea isn't like great or whatever. Sometimes it's literally like, I'm not the right writer at this moment to finish this story, which that happens to me all the time. Like I have ideas for things where I write them down because I'm like, I feel like in 5 years I'll be ready to write this. Not even just mentally, but like I'll be a better writer and I'll be like able to tackle this in the way that it deserves to be tackled. And like, I think part of becoming a writer is learning how to recognize when a problem is fixable or not fixable, right? And so for me, it's like, right, is this it? What am I missing? Is this a fixable problem? Is it like a matter of time? Is it just a matter of like, you know, figuring something out? Like what is, you know, is there a challenge I have to put forth for myself? And sort of just like figuring that out and like moving forward. So yeah, I don't know, like when it gets hard, I mean, when it gets hard, I reread books that I love. Like I read books or books that are doing the thing that I want to be doing, because I think it's also really easy to be like, to forget that people have written for a very long time. And, you know, I feel like it's a point where I'm like, who writes? Nobody could write. Writing is impossible. Writing is horrible. And then I read like a really good book and I'm like, oh yeah, that person wrote a book and it's really good. And like, I've written this thing and this is pretty good. And like, you know, writing is a thing you can actually achieve. Like it's a very doable thing. And so, yeah, I feel like a lot of this process has been, is just sort of like, oh, you know, it is possible to do it. I can like read a text that shows me how. I can learn, identify like what projects are working or not working. If I need time, if I need experience, if I need distance, if I need to put it away, if the idea is broken. Like, I feel like a lot of like becoming a writer is like learning to like sense that and just being like, okay, like I think I know what's going on here. Which is like, but it's a tall order. Because I mean, I first started writing, I had no fucking clue. I didn't know how I knew a story was finished. I didn't know if I knew like how to put a story away. Like I just had no idea. And I feel like I just had to like train myself to figure that out.
Yeah, and it's like, I think thank you. I think that was a very incredibly useful answer. And I think it's also like, it's a tall order because it involves a lot of cultivation of like self-honesty over time. And also I think part of it is learning to like trust yourself, which can be harder. You know, I remember, you know, reading early drafts and thinking like, I get this weird feeling in my stomach, sort of seasick every time I, you know, read chapter 2 or whatever. But I was like, but maybe like other people will like it. And then, but you know, learning to internally optimistic thinking. But like, yeah, but actually kind of learning to trust those sort of feelings in your body and to be like, no, you feel seasick when you read this because it is bad and you need to like fix it or get rid of it. But I think that's like, do you feel like that's because when you talk about now having kind of gotten these kind of like diagnostic skills, like, do you feel like that's part of it for you? Just also like learning to kind of trust yourself.
I think it's about learning to trust yourself. I also think that this is my theory about the value of a workshop in whatever form that takes, whether that's at an MFA or not. But like, people like to talk about workshops as though it's like something to do with like the person bringing the story in, the person being workshopped. And obviously there is some value in that because you're getting a cold read, you're getting like feedback, you know, there's like things that it offers. But honestly, I think that the most value in a workshop is learning how to talk about other people's writing. Because like when I first got to like Iowa, I remember getting my first like set of workshop stories and like reading them. And of course, my classmates were all fucking brilliant. I remember like reading this, like a chapter or like of someone's book or like a short story and being like, I don't know. I mean, it reads like a story I'd read in a magazine or it reads like a chapter of a novel. I don't know. I don't have any thoughts about what one would do with something like this. And like, I feel like the first like year of grad school was me learning how to like read a piece of writing and like identify where a thing is not working, right? Whether it's like pacing or language or character, or whatever, like beyond just like, you know, fixing typos and like continuity errors, where it's like, there's actually something that's like not quite working and like kind of running your fingers through it to find the lumps, right? But like, you have to learn how to do that. Like that doesn't just come to you naturally. Like no one knows how to do that. And honestly, for me, it was like, week after week, like mostly what I was doing was not being workshopped, but workshopping other people's stories. And mostly what I was learning was like, how do you like identify a problem? And when your spidey senses are tingling and you're like, this is not working for some reason, and you learn how to like explain that. And eventually you learn how to then do that for yourself. So like, you know, at this point, like I've, you know, been out of grad school for years and I do occasionally give my work to like specific friends where I'm like, I'm having a problem with a plot. Oh, I'm going to call so-and-so and like, we'll talk through it. And like, you know, but like, I don't workshop my work anymore, not because I'm like above it or something, but I'm like, I actually know like all the skills that I learned of how to like drag my fingers through the draft and find the lumps. I can do a lot of that on my own. And then if I'm still stuck, and then I have like individual people that I will go to where I'm like, I need help with like this thing and something's not working and I can't figure out what it is. But like, you know, that, but like all the workshop did its job, which is like, it taught me how to like talk about writing and how to like read my own work and like find the things that are like working in an obvious way. So yeah, so like at this point, yeah, it's like I've just trained myself. I just like at this point, I've been trained and I just know how to do it. Whereas like I did not for a very long time. And that was a thing that I could not do in my early 20s. So
yes, no, I nor I, but yeah, I think that's great sort of counsel on how like what the workshop is most adept at. But thank you. So we're at about 6:40. I see that there are many questions in the Q&A. So I think like I have more questions for you, but I want to give folks a chance to have their questions answered. So let's see what we got here. Okay. So here is the first one. I'm writing my senior paper on her body and other parties, and I'm so excited. I was wondering why you choose to contrast heterosexual and homosexual relationships throughout all of the 8 stories.
Oh, are they contrasting or are they simply there? I don't know. That is so funny that you would ask that. I mean, I feel like it really depends on the mode of literary criticism you want to apply. If you want to apply like an identity mode, I am technically bisexual and spent the first 25 years of my dating life, 24 years of my life dating men, and now have been in relationships only with women for the other remaining years of my life. And so, you could argue that like, I mean, I was always queer, but like, there was a time in which like that dynamic of like a heterosexual relationship was one that I was quite familiar with, and is one that, especially when I came into writing that first book, into Her Body and Other Parties, like I was mostly coming sort of fresh off of dating men exclusively, not just because that's just what had happened. So yeah, so I feel like probably that's why. I guess you could also say that I am interested in like how both those kinds of relationships present socially. And so that's just why they appear throughout the book. But I don't know, it's just like what I wanted to write. I don't know. I feel like I'm really bad at answering questions like this, but. Yeah.
All right, our next one is how to handle writing such personal topics. I'm currently working on a memoir piece about date rape, and it is really upending me. Any advice for balancing your projects with mental well-being and self-care?
Oh, that's such a good question. First, I actually really want to say, if you're writing a subject about a book about that, or a piece about that, there's this really great book that came out right when my memoir came out called Things We Didn't Talk About When I Was a Girl by Janine, I think Vasquez is her last name. It was a Tin House book, and it's her interviewing her rapist, like with a friend who raped her when she was like a teenager. And it's just devastating memoir, and it's very good and very smart, very intense, but I would highly recommend it. It's like one of my favorite books of the last couple of years. Anyway, sorry, that was a very long detour. So the short answer is I did not take care of myself writing my memoir, and I almost fucking lost my mind. I like did not take care of my mental health. I stopped going to therapy. I wrote it far away from my spouse. I didn't really sort of access my support networks, and I almost drove myself into the ground in the process. And that has been true sort of every phase of that book was like me not necessarily doing the best thing for myself in the process, which I don't recommend. I mean, I think what's I can say is like, you have to really identify what you need, and you have to really be serious about taking that on, and asking for help if you need help, and like, trying to kind of work your way through it. It's not easy, but you kind of have to. And also like, sometimes it's also not the right moment for a project. I mean, like, I can't speak to your experience at all, the person who asked this question, but like, I think that you always have to ask yourself, like, is this the moment, sort of for me, psychologically speaking, like, is this the moment for me to like approach this material? So I think you have to like ask that question to yourself kind of throughout the process.
Yeah, thank you. Sounds like the answer to this question might be no, but I'll ask it anyway. Have you experienced being in a home that is haunted?
Oh, I mean, it really depends how you define haunting. If you're asking, have I been in a house where I've thought there was a literal ghost? No, I have not. But have I been in a haunted house? Of course. I've been in many haunted houses. I've been in places where time is collapsing within the space of like some brick and mortar, and like there are things that exist in the space that like persist from another era, and like, yeah, so yes and no at the same time, I guess, is the answer to that question.
Thinking about your reflections upon queer futurity and Jose Esteban Munoz in The Dream House, what do you think, how do you try to write about futurity in the broader context of trauma?
That is such a
This is from Zach.
Thank you, Zach, for that deeply academic question that I'm not entirely sure I know how to answer. I'm gonna make some guesses about what some things mean, and I'm just gonna plow right ahead. I think there's something really interesting about thinking of, I guess this idea of futurity or like queer futures, for example, in the context of a place of bruising and brokenness, right? Like, how do you move forward when you're coming from a space that is, traumatic or broken in some really essential way? I don't know if I have I think Jose Esteban Munoz definitely knows, and you should read him, as we all should, but I don't know if I have quite a super developed answer to that. I feel like for me, my approach to trauma is I have to address it. For me, my book was, I was it's not enough for this to simply be a piece of my life. I really want to actually push into it and take it apart and begin that process. And that was essential for me. I don't know if I can speak to that in a broader sense, if that's what everyone should be doing with all their fucking trauma, but that's the way that I know how to think about things, is on the page. And so it just is the space that receives all of my shit. So yeah.
Moving away towards process, would you be willing to share the novels you started to write but had to abandon? I think share a little bit about the novels you started to write but had to abandon. Did any of them work their way into your short stories?
Oh, that's such a great question. Well, I'm not going to mention, okay, I'll tell you about one, because I feel I always think maybe one day I'll be able to write these books. And so maybe I shouldn't spoil them for myself, but I did, my first residency I ever did was at the Millay Colony of the Arts in upstate New York. And right before I went to Millay, I had moved to Philadelphia the year before, and I had been working at Lush, the beauty product store, because I couldn't find another job. And so I had spent the year selling these bougie ass fucking bath products to rich ladies at the King of Prussia Mall, and coming home every day smelling Lush products, and was having a lot of feelings and thoughts about this retail space that I had been in for a million years, and wrote a not very good novel sort of set in a fantastical version of Lush. It didn't quite take. I wonder sometimes if I'll ever try to do it again, or I'll try to make it into something else. But that was a project that I spent a good chunk of the residency writing this book that no one's ever seen, and just tearing through it and being this is brilliant, I love this is great. And then I read it when it was done, and I was not really very good. Gonna put that away.
This is, I think, a really interesting question about genre in your story inventory. You discussed how formal aspects of genre shape your writing, but I love the way you complicate and upend genre expectations. For example, I loved how inventory starts as an inventory of relationships, and then the world ends and it still holds on to making that end of a story of relationships. Can you say more about how genres collide in your work?
Yeah, I find genre, I feel and I will not even begin to engage. Now, this is not what the question is asking, but I never engage in these weird ass fights about which genre is it, whatever, is a superior literary fit, whatever. Genre is a tool. Genre is a tool like any other piece of writing. And what genre is it's a way of setting expectations for a reader. So if I tell you that I've written a realist novel, but then a dragon comes crashing through the window, you'd be like, fuck you, this isn't a realist novel. This is not what I was expecting, right? And there's things in genre about subject and world building and tone and language, and you're creating these expectations. And then the beauty of that is then you can subvert or invert or, you do all this stuff to the expectations and create in the reader that beautiful sense of imbalance that I feel makes a reader feel unmoored by a piece of writing, which to me is the perfect effect that I want to be creating at all times. And so, yeah, for me, like genre is a way to do that. And like, you know, inventory in particular, like I wanted it to be, I mean, the idea initially was I wanted to tell a story in the shape of with sex scenes as like sort of the metric of the structure of the story. So it was like every paragraph is a sex scene. Got it. I'm just going to do that from beginning to end. But then of course I was like, well, that's not enough. Like it's just not enough to have a person just like fucking. I mean, I guess you could, but I was like, you know, there's got to be something else kind of going on. And I was thinking a lot about foregrounding and backgrounding. And I was actually, I thought a lot about one of my favorite movies in the world is Children of Men, which is a really beautiful movie if you haven't seen it. And that is a science fictional film that is about a lot of things, including like parenthood and grief and loss, but it's like set against this, you know, this very hard, this like intense sci-fi background of this like pandemic. In which people can't have babies anymore. And so the world is kind of like getting older and like freaking the fuck out. And like, there's all this work happening, both literally in like the actual like cinematography or whatever of the film, and also just like the thematics of like back and forth between the background and the foreground. And like, so then I thought about that, and then I thought about, and this is all pre-COVID, but I was like, oh, what about a pandemic? Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so she's like, she shouldn't be near people, but she wants to be because she's like in her hoe phase and like she's just trying to do all her things. So like, perfect, great. That's a great like energy. And then I just sort of like let it roll. Like I was like, and that story actually like, this is not normal. But that story took me like 2 hours to write and is basically the version that's in the book. I mean, like there are some edits and I think the initial version might've been in a different tense than like the final one. But like, I felt like that story, because like, it just felt like the stakes of the story and the way the genre was operating, and thinking about the pandemic and thinking about loneliness and isolation and all these things we've all been learning about so intimately over the past couple of years, like thinking about in the context of like, oh, but I want to be having sex. Like it just, the story just felt, it just kind of like erupted in this way that felt like really organic. So yeah, so to me, like genre as a tool, and it's like one of many, it's like form. It's like a thing that I can use to my advantage, and I can like use it and subvert it and play with it. And eventually hopefully it all comes together.
Yeah, that was a fantastic answer. Thank you. We got a question about short stories. Right. You said one of the reasons you like short story writing is because you know how the form works. Can you talk more about that? i.e., what are the key elements for you?
You know, it's so funny because I feel like one of the things, like I've tried to write a novel several times, and every time I write it, I've had this experience that I keep forgetting is a thing and then remembering, which is that I can't hold all of a novel's information in my brain at one time. It's just impossible. So I'll be like, wait, what happened to that person? Or like, where does that person, like, what's happening? And like, cannot remember what I have written. And like, I remember mentioning this to my spouse, who is a novelist and like has written novels and like took, you know, and I remember her sending me an email from her like MFA advisor. And the person was like, if you're in the correct place in a novel, or if the novel's working, you feel like you're in a giant bowl of spaghetti and you're trying to kind of like grab all the noodles. There's just like noodles everywhere. You're just like, oh my God. And that's like the process of writing a novel, which like, to me, I'm like, fine on that. I don't want to do that. That's a lot of work. But like a short story, I feel like I can hold a short story in my brain at one time, and I feel I can sort of like hold it and like turn it and like look at it in different ways. Whereas like a novel, I feel like I'm just being like crushed to death by a giant bowl of spaghetti. And that's like, it's just not a feeling I want to have, or at least not yet. Right. And so, yeah, I don't know. For me, I guess like there's something about like the rhythm of a short story. There's something about like the sort of the surprise of a short story, where there's like, I mean, I feel like so many short stories, like where you're just like, you don't see like a little turn coming, and then you're just like, fuck, and then it's done and it's over. And you're like, oh my God. Like, I was just in this thing and suddenly I'm out of this thing and I'm like in shock and I'm confused and like, you know, and there's something, and like being, I think, trapped in a novel is like an entirely different like emotional experience. Like, not in a bad way, not like, but like where you're like, if you're reading a short story that's stressful in a good, productive way, you're like, oh my God. And then it like shoots you out the other side like a fucking water slide. And you're like, what just happened? Where am I? Like, what's going on? Whereas a novel, it's like being trapped in a van, you know, for like days. And you're just like, what is so I feel like, sorry, these are all like very weird metaphors, but there's something about that process that feels like so different for me, as like also as a reader as well, where it's like the experience of like encountering a story that feels like a match in the dark, you know, and it's like there and it flares and it's gone. And you have to like either revisit it or redo it. Like, you just, you know, but like the experience of it is so brief and so powerful and so singular. Whereas like reading a novel is like a different kind of experience. So I think for me, there's something about the brevity of it. I can hold the whole thing in my brain at once. It's easier to like move it around and move things around inside of it. And like, I feel like I know when it's done in this way that feels really clear to me. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's not a very good answer. It's very like all over the place, but like, I don't know, for me, the form just feels so achievable and so I can like hold it in my hand, and that's like what I want to experience as a writer.
Yes, I think death by a giant bowl of spaghetti. Very accurate.
Yeah, okay, good.
I'm currently you can't see it, but it's like, I feel like it's just above my head being crushed by a giant bowl of spaghetti. And it's, and also this like Groundhog Day of feeling like, I got it. And then waking up the next day and reading pages and being like, oh no, I absolutely do not have it. What are the stories?
I don't want to do that.
Yeah, it's like you have it or like you don't have it, but you kind of know one way or the other.
Right.
Yeah, a little bit sooner. So this is I'll check in where we are with time, but we're getting close to the top of the hour. This is a question that's taking us back to In the Dream House. From Alexa. Thank you so much for being here and for your writing. I read In the Dream House after getting out of an emotionally abusive queer relationship, and it has really helped me process what was happening to me. I'm curious what kind of resources you wish were out there on queer abusive relationships, and if you wrote with the intention of having the book as a resource support to people.
That's a great question. So I guess the first sort of thing to say is that there are resources that exist. The reason I wrote the book was because I was looking kind of explicitly in sort of the aftermath of my situation for a sort of memoir type book that addressed this subject. And there is like a lot of sort of scholarship on it, like a lot of academics and, social scientists and people have tried to tackle it in various forms. There's a lot been written about it in legal papers and like in the legal sense, but like there just wasn't kind of the exact thing I was looking for, which is why I wrote the book. And part of it was I did like the idea of it being resource such a clinical word. And it's hard because I also I am a big believer in like not writing for other people. Like I write for myself, like I write to satisfy myself. And I try to think about my audience too much because I would actually go mad, and any writer would go mad trying to think too much about the readers. Like you have to just kind of like create the book you want to create. That being said, writing this book did feel like I was sort of trying to engage with or like reach it. I was trying to create something for my own community and thinking about like, what does it mean? It's like, I was like, I'm feeling kind of unmoored and like uncertain, and there's like all this stuff that I'm trying to figure out, and I bet like I'm not the only person who feels this way. And so like maybe if I write this book, it'll be like a thing that people can kind of like hold on to, and that until and then like I obviously want there to be like a million books written like this, and like I want this to be like a thing, like the beginning of like a subgenre, I guess, or whatever. Like I want that to be sort of an ongoing thing. But yeah, like it's weird because like on one hand, I like also like couldn't like, I was trying to think too much about my audience while also writing a book for an audience, which is like just a weird experience, and one that I actually do not want to reproduce anytime soon. Like I like writing my weird short stories that I don't really think about or care who's reading them. I'm just like, whatever, who cares? But yeah, like, I don't know, like it was a weird moment where that book did feel like sort of both. And like, I wanted it to be helpful. I'm glad it was helpful for you. Like, I think that like, that makes me feel like it was worth it in a way. Cause I oftentimes wonder if it was worth it. The process of writing that book was so hard. But I was writing it, I think, for other people, or at least to give them a sense of clarity or a thing to hold on to, at least to try.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think we're at 7. I think that this question from Carlos would be a good question for us to end with, probably. Right. What are your absolute must-read horror short story collections?
Ooh, that's such a good
that's a fun. That's a fun one.
My favorite one I've recommended for years, which I'm sure, Laura, if you read, is Revenge by Yoko Agawa. Right?
Yeah, one of my like absolute favorites, blew my brain apart in the happiest, best way. So good. Yeah.
Highly, highly recommend. If you have not read her, you absolutely must. What about you?
I love Mariana Enriquez's work a lot. Things We Lost in the Fire is, and I mean, I'm using horror kind of,
sure, of course,
loosely, but that I think, that's the one that's coming to me right now. I think it's Adela's house in there is a great haunted house story. But I really love, and she has a new collection that came out, I think last year. But yeah, Things We Lost in the Fire is tremendous. I think, just to like really nerd out on short story collections for a second, but another thing I love about revenge too is that I had this idea that a story collection was kind of like unlinked or linked. And if it was linked, they all had the same character, like in Jesus' Son, for example. And what I love about, one of the many things I love about revenge is how you have these details that repeat and these characters that repeat. And so there is this like thematic linkage, but it's not as kind of formally like tight as Winesburg, Ohio, or Jesus' Son, where it's like all the stories are set in the same place, so they all have the same narrator. It was one of those collections that like really expanded my understanding of what short story collection could like hold, you know, and how it could be shaped. But
yeah, it was so true. And that book, because structurally, right, or it's like there's just so many questions that you are never resolved. Like it's like, like you can tell that they all exist in the same universe, and sort of moving in the same way. And it's such a good book.
Yeah. I think in the same universe is actually the language I was looking for, and that I became really interested in collections that were not, formally linked, but like, you had the sense that we were kind of moving through the same sort of space. So if you haven't read Revenge, you know what to do. All right. I think that would be a good place to leave us this evening, since we're a little bit past 7. Carmen, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being so generous and insightful with our community. Wonderful audience. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your questions. If we didn't get to it, I'm so sorry. But we are bound to the clock, alas. And thank you to Mahindra as well. And I hope everyone has a good night.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. Goodbye. Thanks for coming out.
Bye.